Story number 1. Shadows of Christmas Past. I never thought of myself as superstitious. Ghost stories, hauntings, and tales of restless spirits had always seemed like nothing more than a distraction for the overly imaginative. But one Christmas in London changed all that. A night I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. It was December 2015, and my family had gathered to celebrate the holiday season at the ancestral home of my wife, Margaret. The house, a sprawling Georgian manor in the quiet outskirts of London, had been in her family for generations. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find on the cover of a Gothic novel. Tall, narrow windows, ivy creeping along the stone facade, and the faint creak of ancient wood with every step. Margaret's family had always been proud of the house's history, even if parts of it were tinged with tragedy. One of the oldest tales involved a young maid named Elizabeth, who had worked for the family more than a century ago. According to local lore, Elizabeth had been murdered on Christmas Eve by an unknown assailant. Her body was discovered in the servants' quarters, and though the police investigated, the crime was never solved. Some said her spirit never left, but the family had long since dismissed the story as nothing more than a grim legend. We arrived at the manor in the early afternoon, greeted by the warm glow of candlelight and the enticing aroma of roasted meats and spiced wine. The dining room was magnificent, its long table adorned with holly, ivy, and flickering candelabras. A crackling fire roared in the grand hearth, filling the room with an inviting warmth. For all its age and creaky charm, the house felt alive with holiday cheer. As we sat down to dinner, the conversation flowed easily, a mix of laughter and shared memories. Margaret's brother, James, regaled us with stories of past Christmases in the house. His voice animated as he described the grand feasts their grandparents used to host. For a moment, felt like we were stepping back in time, part of a tradition that had lasted for centuries. But then, the atmosphere began to change. It started subtly, an inexplicable chill that seemed to seep into the room despite the roaring fire. At first, we ignored it, chalking it up to the draftiness of the old house. But as the meal progressed, the temperature dropped further, and a sense of unease began to settle over the table. "Does anyone else feel that?" James finally asked, his breath visible in the frosty air. Margaret frowned, glancing toward the fireplace. "The fire's burning strong. It doesn't make sense." I tried to brush it off, cracking a joke about old houses and bad insulation. But the unease was growing. The candle flames flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows on the ornate walls. One of the shadows, longer and darker than the others, seemed to linger in the corner of the room. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the figure in the corner was unmistakably real. She was a young woman, dressed in a maid's uniform straight out of the Victorian era. Her face was pale, her expression blank, and her dark eyes seemed to pierce right through me. She stood motionless, her hands clasped in front of her, as though she were waiting for instructions. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Margaret, my voice trembling. "See what?" she asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "In the corner," I said, pointing toward the figure. But by the time she turned to look, the maid was gone. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze. I couldn't shake the image of the maid from my mind, nor could I explain the sense of foreboding that hung over the room. After dessert, we moved to the parlor for drinks, but the unease followed us. The fire refused to provide warmth, and the flickering candles seemed to cast shadows that didn't belong. As the evening wore on, strange things began to happen. Margaret's mother, Eleanor, complained of hearing faint whispers, as though someone were speaking just out of earshot. James swore he felt a hand brush against his shoulder, though no one was standing near him. And then there were the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the servants' quarters. "Enough," Margaret finally said, her voice firm but tinged with fear. "Let's get to the bottom of this." Reluctantly, we made our way toward the servants' quarters. guided by the dim light of a lantern. The corridor was cold and dark, the walls lined with faded portraits of long-forgotten family members. As we approached the door to what had once been Elizabeth's room, the air grew heavier, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Margaret pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room was exactly as you'd expect for a servant's quarters. Small, sparsely furnished, and shrouded in an air of melancholy. A single candle flickered on the windowsill. Though none of us had lit it, the temperature plummeted further, and the whispers Eleanor had described grew louder, filling the room with an eerie chorus. And then we saw her again. Elizabeth stood at the foot of the narrow bed, her head bowed and her hands clasped tightly. This time, there was no mistaking her presence. Her form was solid, her features etched with sadness. She lifted her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow, as though I were witnessing a tragedy too great to bear. "She's trying to tell us something," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. Before any of us could respond, Elizabeth raised her hand and pointed toward a loose floorboard near the bed. The gesture was deliberate, her intention clear. With shaking hands, James knelt down and pried the board loose. Beneath it, we found a small, tarnished locket. Inside was a faded photograph of a young man and a note written in elegant cursive. The note read, "My dearest Thomas, if you find this, know that I forgive you. Yours forever, Elizabeth." We stared at the locket in stunned silence, the weight of the discovery sinking in. It was clear that Elizabeth had loved this Thomas. But what had happened between them? And why had she hidden this locket? As we pieced the story together, the whispers grew softer, fading into the stillness of the room. Elizabeth's form began to dissolve, her features softening as a faint smile crossed her lips. She nodded once, a gesture of gratitude, before vanishing completely. The room grew warm again, and the oppressive energy lifted. It was as though a great weight had been lifted from the house, and a sense of peace settled over us. In the days that followed, we researched Elizabeth's story. We discovered that Thomas had been a stable boy who worked at the manor, and their love had been forbidden by the strict social norms of the time. On Christmas Eve, Thomas had been caught sneaking into the servants' quarters to see Elizabeth, and in the ensuing confrontation, Elizabeth had been fatally wounded. Her death had been ruled an accident, but her spirit had lingered, trapped by her unresolved grief. By finding her locket and learning her story, we had given Elizabeth the closure she needed. That Christmas, we placed the locket on the mantel as a reminder of her and the power of love and forgiveness. The house, once cold and haunted, now felt warm and welcoming, the shadows no longer threatening. Years later, I still think of Elizabeth every Christmas. Her story serves as a poignant reminder of the past, a haunting yet beautiful tale of love, loss, and redemption. The shadows of Christmas past may linger, but they also teach us to cherish the present and honor those who came before us. And so, the legacy of Elizabeth lives on, not as a ghostly figure haunting the halls, but as a symbol of resilience and the enduring power of the human spirit. Story number 2. An uninvited guest. I've always loved Christmas. The lights, the laughter, the warmth of family coming together. It was the one time of year when our busy lives slowed down, and we could truly savor the moment. But Christmas 2014 was different. It was the year my family's cozy New York apartment became the stage for something none of us could explain. Something that still chills me to this day. The evening began like any other holiday celebration. My wife, Emily, had outdone herself with the decorations. Garlands wrapped around the banisters, candles flickering on every surface, and a magnificent Christmas tree standing proudly in the corner of our living room. The scent of roasted turkey and freshly baked pies filled the air, mingling with the cheerful sound of Christmas carols playing softly in the background. Our guests arrived one by one: Emily's parents, my brother Daniel and his wife, and a handful of close friends. We were a small but lively group, laughing and chatting as we settled around the dinner table. Our daughter, Lily, was especially excited. 6 years old. She was the life of the party, giggling as she showed off her favorite Christmas dress and eagerly awaiting her turn to open presents. As the evening progressed, everything seemed perfect. We raised our glasses for a toast, sharing our hopes for the coming year. When it happened, the front door, which we had firmly locked earlier, swung open with a sudden, forceful creak. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes snapping toward the entrance. A gust of cold air rushed in, extinguishing several candles and sending a shiver through the room. We stared at the open door, half expecting someone to walk in, but the doorway remained empty. Maybe the wind? Emily offered weakly, already rising to close it. But Lily's voice stopped her mid-step. "Wait," Lily said, her small finger pointing toward the empty chair at the far end of the table. "There's someone sitting there." A hush fell over the room. We all turned to look at the chair. It was empty completely, undeniably empty. But Lily was adamant, her innocent eyes wide with certainty. "A little boy," she whispered. "He's sitting right there." "Sweetheart, there's no one there," I said gently, trying to keep my voice calm. But the way Lily stared at that chair, unblinking and serious, sent a chill crawling up my spine. The tension in the room was palpable as Emily quietly closed the door and locked it again. We tried to move on, returning to our conversations, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was as if an invisible weight had settled over the room, pressing down on us. As the evening wore on, the unease grew. Lily kept glancing at the chair, occasionally tilting her head as if listening to someone we couldn't hear. When I asked her what was wrong, she simply shrugged and said, "He's just watching." By the time the guests left, the air in the apartment felt heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that makes your skin prickle. After cleaning up, Emily and I tucked Lily into bed, assuring her that everything was fine. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Lily, wandering to the kitchen for a glass of water. But as I lay in bed, listening, I realized the steps were too light, too irregular, like the hesitant patter of small feet. They moved through the apartment, pausing near the living room before continuing toward Lily's room. Heart pounding, I climbed out of bed and crept down the hallway. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the Christmas tree. As I approached Lily's room, I heard it, a soft, childlike giggle, echoing faintly from behind her door. I pushed the door open and found Lily sound asleep, her small chest rising and falling peacefully. But her rocking horse, which we'd placed in the corner of her room earlier, was swaying gently back and forth, its rhythmic creak cutting through the silence. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I walked over and stopped the rocking horse, my fingers trembling as I touched its wooden surface. The room was icy cold, and for a brief moment, I felt the unmistakable sensation of someone standing behind me. But when I turned, there was no one there. The strange occurrences didn't stop. Over the next few nights, we heard more footsteps, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and occasional bursts of soft, high-pitched laughter. Objects would move inexplicably. A toy car rolling across the floor on its own, a chair slightly out of place, the Christmas lights flickering despite being brand new. Lily spoke of the boy often, describing him as pale and quiet, with dark eyes that seemed sad. "He doesn't talk much," she said one morning over breakfast, "but he likes to watch." Emily and I were at a loss. We considered calling a professional. But how do you explain something like this without sounding crazy? It wasn't until Lily mentioned the boy's name, "His name is Peter," she said casually, that we decided to investigate further. A search through local records revealed a chilling connection. Decades ago, a boy named Peter had lived in our building with his family. On Christmas Eve in 1947, he had fallen down the building's central staircase while chasing a toy train. He died instantly. The tragedy had shaken the community. But over time, the story had faded into obscurity. The discovery left us shaken. Had Peter somehow returned, drawn to our Christmas celebration? And if so, what did he want? On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 week after the initial incident, we decided to address the spirit directly, following advice we found online. We lit a candle in the living room and placed one of Lily's toys, the rocking horse, near the Christmas tree as an offering. "Peter," Emily said softly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If you're here, we want you to know that you're welcome to stay, but we also want you to find peace. You don't have to stay here anymore." For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent. The candles flamed steady. Then, the rocking horse began to move, its gentle creak filling the room. A faint, cold breeze brushed past us, and Lily smiled. "He's happy now," she said simply. The footsteps and whispers stopped after that night. The house grew warm again, the oppressive energy replaced by a sense of calm. We kept the rocking horse in the living room as a tribute to Peter. And every Christmas since, we light a candle in his memory. Though the experience left us shaken, it also taught us the importance of empathy and understanding. Peter's story became a part of our family's history, a reminder that even in death, we are drawn to love, warmth, and connection. And every Christmas Eve, as the candle flickers softly on the mantel, I like to think Peter is still watching, his spirit finally at peace. Story number 3. The turkey on Oakwood Lane. I always loved Christmas. The food, the family, the warmth of a home filled with laughter. It was the kind of holiday you cherished, a time to put aside the stresses of life and bask in the glow of togetherness. But the Christmas of 2012 in Kansas would forever haunt me. It was the year my family's holiday turned into something out of a nightmare. We'd recently moved into a charming old house on Oakwood Lane, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Wichita. The house had a certain rustic charm, with its wide front porch, creaking wooden floors, and stone fireplace. It had been a dream come true for us, a place where my wife, Lisa, and I could raise our 2 kids, Sophie and Ben. That Christmas, we decided to host dinner for the first time in the new house. Lisa went all out with the decorations, stringing lights along the eaves and filling every corner with garlands and ornaments. The centerpiece of the celebration was to be her famous turkey pie, a family recipe passed down through generations, stuffed with savory fillings and baked to golden perfection. It was tradition, and Lisa had spent all day preparing it. Our guests arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. The house was alive with the sounds of laughter and Christmas carols. The air smelled of cinnamon, roasted chestnuts, and, of course, the turkey pie baking in the oven. By the time we all sat down at the table, the mood was festive, the conversation flowing easily. When Lisa brought out the pie, it looked perfect. The crust was golden, the aroma mouth-watering. We passed it around, each taking a generous slice. Couldn't wait to dig in. But the moment my knife sank into the pie, I felt resistance, something hard and unyielding beneath the tender layers of meat and pastry. "Must be a bone," I muttered, pulling the knife free. I reached into the slice, fishing out the obstruction. My fingers closed around something cold and jagged. It wasn't a bone. At least, not a turkey bone. The room fell silent as I held it up to the light. It was small, no longer than my pinky finger, and distinctly human. A sickening realization washed over me. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Lisa stared at it, her face pale. It can't be," she stammered. "I cleaned everything before cooking. I swear." I pushed my plate away, my appetite replaced by a growing sense of dread. The others followed suit, their unease palpable. "Maybe it's a mistake," Lisa said weakly, but her voice betrayed her disbelief. It wasn't just the bone. As we inspected the pie, we found more fragments, splinters of ribs, a piece of what looked like a jawbone, even a small, cracked tooth. Each discovery deepened the horror, and soon, no one could eat another bite. That night, after our guests had left, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Lisa was distraught, replaying every step of the preparation process in her head, searching for answers. "I bought the turkey from the usual butcher," she insisted. "I don't understand how this could happen." But as the hours ticked by, our questions remained unanswered. We decided to dispose of the pie, wrapping it tightly and tossing it into the trash bin outside. I figured that would be the end of it, that we could move on and forget the incident. Couldn't have been more wrong. The first sign that something was wrong came the next evening. I was sitting in the living room, reading, when I heard it, a faint knock at the front door. It was soft, almost hesitant, but persistent. Thinking it was a neighbor, I got up and opened the door. No one was there. The street was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the winter wind. I shrugged it off, assuming it was kids playing a prank, and went back inside. But the knocking returned, louder this time, and more insistent. When I opened the door again, there was nothing but the empty street staring back at me. That night, as we lay in bed, Lisa and I both heard it, footsteps, light and deliberate, pacing just outside our bedroom door. I grabbed a baseball bat and yanked the door open, but the hallway was empty. Still, the footsteps continued, fading into the distance as if retreating down the stairs. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences multiplied. Sophie and Ben complained of cold drafts in their rooms. Even though the heat was cranked up, lights flickered inexplicably, and doors opened and closed on their own. At night, we heard laughter, soft, high-pitched, and chilling, echoing through the house. The sense of being watched was inescapable. Like unseen eyes followed our every move. One evening, as we huddled in the living room, Sophie pointed to the window. "There's someone out there," she said, her voice trembling. I rushed to the window, but saw only darkness. "There's no one, sweetheart," I said, trying to reassure her. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Desperate for answers, I began researching the house's history. What I found sent a chill down my spine. Decades ago, a young girl named Clara had disappeared from the neighborhood. She was last seen playing in her backyard, just 2 houses down from ours. Despite an extensive search, she was never found. Rumors swirled that she had been kidnapped. Or worse, the case remained unsolved. The more I read, the more I became convinced that Clara's spirit was tied to the house, or, more specifically, to that cursed turkey pie. But why? And how? The breakthrough came when I spoke to an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Harris, who had lived on Oakwood Lane her entire life. When I mentioned Clara, her face darkened. "Poor girl," she said. "They never found her, you know." But there were whispers, rumors that her remains had been hidden. "Hidden where?" I asked. Mrs. Harris hesitated before answering. "Some said the butcher's shop." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being haunted not by random misfortune, but by a vengeful spirit seeking justice. I decided to confront it directly, following advice I found in an old book about hauntings. We set up a makeshift seance in the living room. Lisa was skeptical, but she agreed to help. We lit candles, placed a photo of Clara we had found online in the center of the table, and called out to her. "Clara," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "If you're here, we want to help. Tell us what you want." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the room grew cold, colder than I'd ever felt before. The candles flickered wildly, and a faint figure began to materialize in the corner of the room. It was a girl, no older than 10, her face pale and her eyes filled with sorrow. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They never found me." Lisa clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What do you want us to do?" I asked. The girl pointed toward the backyard, her translucent hand trembling. We followed her direction, stepping out into the frigid night with flashlights in hand. Clara's presence guided us to an overgrown patch of earth near the old oak tree. We dug. What we unearthed confirmed our worst fears. Fragments of bone, buried deep beneath the soil. It was Clara's final resting place. Hidden for decades, her story forgotten. The next day, we contacted the authorities, who reopened the case. The discovery made headlines, and Clara's family, long since passed, was finally given closure. As for the haunting, it stopped after that night. The house grew warm again, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if a great weight had been removed. But every Christmas since, we light a candle in Clara's memory, honoring the spirit that found its way to us, seeking justice and peace. I still think about that turkey pie sometimes, about the sinister connection that brought Clara's story back to light. And every time I do, I'm reminded that even in death, some souls refuse to be forgotten. Story number 4. The Silent Hands. Moving to Colorado was supposed to be the start of something new for us. A fresh chapter in a quieter, more peaceful setting. The small mountain town of Windmere, nestled in the foothills of the Rockies, seemed like the perfect place to begin again. My wife, Claire, and I had fallen in love with the house immediately. A charming 2-story cabin with exposed wood beams, large windows, and just enough history to make it interesting. We moved in late November, and by the time Christmas rolled around, the house finally felt like home. To celebrate, we decided to host a holiday dinner with a few close friends. It was our way of christening the new place and sharing its rustic charm with the people we cared about most. The night of the dinner, the snow began falling just as the first guests arrived. The house glowed warmly against the cold, its windows casting golden light onto the white-covered yard. Inside, the air smelled of roast beef, mulled wine, and freshly baked bread. Claire had gone all out with the decorations, stringing garlands and lights across every surface. The Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner of the living room, its ornaments shimmering in the firelight. Our friends arrived one by one: Greg and his wife, Susan, followed by James, who had flown in from Denver just for the evening. The conversation was lively as we gathered around the table, raising glasses to new beginnings and reminiscing about old memories. But then came the sound that changed everything. It was faint at first, barely audible over the laughter and clinking of silverware. A soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from upstairs. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, and glanced at Claire. She heard it too. I could see the confusion in her eyes. Probably just the house settling, Greg said, trying to sound casual. Old places like this make all sorts of noises. I nodded, though the sound didn't feel like the house settling. It felt deliberate. We tried to dismiss it, returning to our meal and conversation. But the tapping persisted, growing louder and more insistent. By the time dessert was served, it had escalated into a series of sharp, heavy knocks that echoed through the house. "Okay, that's not the house settling," James said, setting his glass down. "You sure you don't have raccoons or something up there?" "Maybe," I said, though I doubted it. We hadn't noticed any signs of animals since moving in, and the noise seemed too precise, too deliberate, to be wildlife. "I'll check it out," Greg volunteered, pushing back his chair. "Could be something stuck in the attic." Before I could protest, he was already heading for the stairs. We all watched as he disappeared up the creaky wooden steps, his footsteps fading as he reached the second floor. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace. 5 minutes passed, then 10. "Greg," Susan called out, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. "Are you okay up there?" No response. "Greg, quit messing around," she called again, louder this time. Still, nothing. "I'll go check," I said, standing up. Claire grabbed my arm, her face pale. "Wait," she whispered. What if it's not an animal?" I didn't know what to say. The thought had crossed my mind too. but I didn't want to admit it. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the flashlight we kept by the kitchen door and started up the stairs. The air grew colder as I climbed, the warm glow of the living room giving way to the shadows of the second floor. I reached the landing and called out, "Greg!" Silence. The hallway stretched before me, its wooden floorboards groaning under my weight. At the end of the hall was the guest room, a room we hadn't used since moving in. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I noticed something odd. The faint outline of handprints on the walls, smudged and uneven, as though someone had been pressing their palms against the surface. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the room. It was freezing, the kind of cold that cuts straight through you. The flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing more handprints, hundreds of them, covering every inch of the room. Some were small, like those of a child, while others were large and claw-like, the fingers elongated and jagged. In the corner of the room, something caught my eye, a dark, shadowy shape crouched low to the ground. I aimed the flashlight at it, and my stomach dropped. It was Greg's shoe, just his shoe. No sign of Greg. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, the knocking, but now it was coming from the walls, moving from one side of the hallway to the other as if something was following me. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. Everyone looked up as I burst into the living room, my face pale and my breathing ragged. "Greg's gone," I managed to say. There's something up there." Panic set in. Susan began crying, and James looked like he was about to bolt out the door. Claire grabbed my hand, her grip tight. "What do you mean he's gone?" she demanded. "I mean he's not there," I said. "There's handprints all over the walls, and his shoe, just his shoe." "Call the police," James said. "Now." Claire grabbed her phone and dialed, her hands shaking. While we waited, I locked the doors and windows, trying to reassure everyone that we were safe. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 officers stepping into the house with a calm professionalism that did little to ease our nerves. They searched the upstairs thoroughly but found no trace of Greg. They did, however, notice the handprints. "I've seen some weird things in my time," one of the officers muttered, running a gloved hand over the smudged prints. "But this." They took our statements and promised to conduct a wider search of the area. But as they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg wasn't outside. He was still in the house. The rest of the night passed in a blur. No one slept. The knocking continued intermittently, always coming from a different part of the house. By morning, we were all exhausted, our nerves frayed. The police never found Greg. Weeks turned into months, and his disappearance remained a mystery. Susan moved away shortly after, unable to stay in a place that held so many unanswered questions. As for Claire and me, we sold the house within a year. We couldn't bear to stay. The memories of that night lingered like a dark shadow, the handprints and the knocking forever etched into our minds. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what really happened to Greg. Did he stumble upon something he wasn't supposed to? Did the house itself claim him? As absurd as that sounds, one thing is certain. I'll never forget the sound of those knocks, echoing through the halls, and the cold, empty room with its silent, desperate handprints. Whatever it was that took Greg is still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to come knocking. Story number 5. The Empty Chair. Boston is a city of tradition, with its cobblestone streets, historic brownstones, and centuries-old charm. It's a place that holds onto its past like an old friend. My family has lived here for generations, and Christmas in our Beacon Hill home has always been the highlight of the year. But one Christmas, in 2018, became a memory I wish I could forget. A night when the past came calling in a way I could never have imagined. That year, the snow fell early, blanketing the streets in a pristine, postcard-perfect scene. My wife, Julia, and I were hosting Christmas dinner for a small group of family and friends. Our dining room was aglow with candlelight. The long wooden table adorned with garlands of pine and red berries. The tree in the corner sparkled with ornaments passed down through generations. And the air smelled of roasted ham, mulled cider, and gingerbread cookies. As the guests began to arrive, the house filled with laughter and warmth. My mother-in-law, Nancy, was already scolding my brother, Paul, for sneaking a piece of pie before dinner, and our daughter, Lily, was eagerly showing off the handmade ornaments she'd crafted in school. It was shaping up to be another perfect Christmas. Then came the knock at the door. It was a single, sharp rap that echoed through the house, cutting through the chatter. I exchanged a puzzled glance with Julia. Everyone we'd invited was already here. When I opened the door, a gust of cold air swept in, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something faintly metallic. Standing on the stoop was a man, his shoulders hunched against the chill. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a lined face and piercing blue eyes. His clothes were tattered but clean, and his gloved hands clutched a threadbare cap. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice soft and gravelly. "I was just passing through and saw the lights. Thought I'd ask if there might be a spare plate." For a moment, I hesitated, but it was Christmas, and the man's tired eyes carried a weight of loneliness that I couldn't ignore. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "Come in and warm up." The man's face lit up with gratitude as he stepped into the foyer. He removed his cap, revealing thinning silver hair, and I noticed a faint scar that ran along his jawline. "Thank you," he said simply. Julia, ever the gracious hostess, didn't bat an eye. She set an extra place at the table, and the man introduced himself as Jack. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and kind. He complimented Julia's cooking, listened intently to Nancy's stories, and even laughed at Paul's terrible jokes. He seemed genuinely grateful to be there, and as the evening went on, his presence felt less like an intrusion and more like a reminder of what the season was truly about. After dinner, Jack stood to leave. "I can't thank you enough," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made this old man feel like part of a family again." "Stay for dessert," Julia urged, but Jack shook his head. "I should be on my way," he said, "but Merry Christmas to you all." With that, he slipped out into the snowy night, his figure quickly swallowed by the darkness. It wasn't until the next morning that the unease began to creep in. Julia and I were sipping coffee in the living room, the house quiet except for the hum of the heater. As we scrolled through the photos from the night before, I noticed something strange. "Where's Jack?" I asked, pointing to the screen. Julia leaned in, frowning. "What do you mean?" I flipped through photo after photo, each one capturing the laughter and warmth of the evening. There was Paul gesturing wildly as he told a story, Nancy rolling her eyes, Lily grinning with frosting on her nose. But in every picture, the chair where Jack had sat was empty. "That's not possible," Julia said, her voice tinged with confusion. "He was sitting right there." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. Maybe he moved when the pictures were taken? But the rationalizations felt hollow. In every photo, the chair was vacant, the space around it untouched. Even the plate in front of it was empty, as though it had never been used. The strangeness didn't end there. That evening, as the snow began to fall again, a knock echoed through the house. The same single, sharp rap as the night before. When I opened the door, the stoop was empty, the street silent save for the whisper of falling snow. My chest tightened, a creeping unease settling over me. Julia was in the kitchen when she called out, "Tom, did you leave the back door open?" "No," I said, hurrying to join her. The back door stood ajar, snowflakes swirling into the kitchen. Beyond it, footprints led away from the house, disappearing into the woods behind our property. Over the next few days, the house felt different. It was subtle at first, shadows that seemed to linger too long. the faint sound of footsteps in empty rooms. Julia dismissed it as nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The final piece of the puzzle came from Nancy. Of all people, she'd been listening to the local news and called us. Her voice urgent. "Did you hear about the man who died on Oak Street years ago?" she asked. "No," I said, confused. "What are you talking about?" "A man named Jack Harris," she said. "He was homeless, I think. Got hit by a car on Christmas Eve. Right near your house. They said he used to knock on doors, asking for food." My blood ran cold. "When did this happen?" 15 years ago, I think," Nancy said. "Why?" I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. That night, as the snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, I found myself standing at the front door, staring out into the darkness. I thought of Jack, his kind eyes, his quiet gratitude, the way he'd seemed so at home despite being a stranger. "Thank you," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass, "for spending Christmas with us." The house was silent for a moment. Then, faintly, I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow, retreating into the night. Jack was gone, but I like to think he found what he was looking for. A moment of warmth, a place to belong, even if only for one night. And every Christmas since, we set an extra plate at the table, just in case he decides to come back. Story number 6. The Chandelier's Whisper. Texas in December is unlike anywhere else during the holidays. There's a strange contrast between the mild, crisp air and the warm, flickering lights that adorn every home. For my family, 2015 was our first Christmas in our new house, a sprawling, rustic home on the outskirts of Austin. It was everything we'd ever dreamed of. A large kitchen perfect for hosting dinners, a wide porch overlooking a wooded backyard, and a dining room dominated by a beautiful, vintage chandelier. The house had history, charm, and, as we'd soon learn, secrets. The evening began like any other holiday gathering. My wife, Laura, had outdone herself with the decorations. Garlands draped along the banisters, a Christmas tree twinkling in the corner, and a dining table set with red and gold accents. We'd invited a small group of friends and family for dinner, and the house buzzed with laughter and the clinking of glasses. The chandelier above the dining table was the crown jewel of the house, made of intricate wrought iron and adorned with crystal pendants, cast a warm, golden glow over the room. It was the first thing we'd noticed during the open house, and its grandeur had sealed the deal. That night, it sparkled beautifully, its light refracting through the crystals, adding a magical touch to our celebration. As dinner progressed, everything seemed perfect. Plates were passed around, stories were shared, and the house felt alive with holiday spirit. But then, as Laura was serving dessert, it happened. The chandelier began to sway. At first, it was subtle, a gentle movement that barely caught my attention. I assumed it was the vibration of footsteps or the hum of conversation. But within moments, the swaying grew more pronounced, the crystals clinking together like wind chimes in a storm. Everyone fell silent, their eyes fixed on the light fixture as it swung back and forth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "There's no draft," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not even windy outside. It's probably just the house settling." I offered weakly, though I didn't believe it myself. The movement was too deliberate, too unnatural. Then Lisa, a close friend of ours, gasped. She was sitting closest to the chandelier, her hand clutching the edge of the table. Something touched me," she stammered, her face pale. It was cold, like ice. The mood shifted instantly. Laughter and chatter gave way to a tense, uneasy silence. Lisa's husband, Mark, put an arm around her, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Are you sure?" he asked, though his voice lacked conviction. Lisa nodded, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. "It felt like a hand. Right here." She gestured to her shoulder, rubbing it as if trying to erase the sensation. I tried to shake off the growing unease. Maybe it was your imagination, I said, forcing a smile. This house is old, things creak. Drafts move things around. It's nothing. But even as I spoke, I could feel it too, the subtle shift in the air, the weight of something unseen pressing down on the room. The chandelier had stopped swaying, but its crystals continued to tremble, catching the light in a way that felt almost menacing. After dinner, we decided to move to the living room, hoping to shake off the strange incident with drinks and Christmas music. But the unease lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. As the evening wore on, more strange occurrences began to unfold. The lights flickered intermittently, and the Christmas tree seemed to dim and brighten on its own, as if it had its own heartbeat. At one point, Laura swore she heard faint whispers coming from the dining room, but when I went to check, it was empty. It's just the old wiring, I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. But the looks on our guests' faces told me they weren't buying it. The breaking point came when Mark decided to investigate the chandelier. It's probably loose, he said, grabbing a chair to stand on. Let me take a look. As he reached up to touch it, the room grew eerily silent. The air felt heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. Mark's fingers barely brushed the iron frame when the chandelier shuddered violently, sending a cascade of crystals crashing to the table below. Everyone screamed, leaping back as shards of glass scattered across the floor. Mark scrambled down, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice shaking. No one had an answer. After the guests left, Laura and I cleaned up in tense silence. The chandelier hung ominously above us, its remaining crystals glinting like eyes in the dim light. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though every glance over my shoulder revealed nothing but shadows. That night, as we lay in bed, Laura turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's haunted?" I wanted to laugh, to dismiss the idea as absurd, but the events of the evening had shaken me more than I cared to admit. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but something's not right." The next morning, I decided to do some research on the house's history. I reached out to the local historical society and spent hours poring over old records and newspaper clippings. What I found was both fascinating and chilling. In the 1930s, the house had belonged to a family named the Harpers. On Christmas Eve, 1935, a fire had broken out during their holiday dinner, trapping the entire family inside. The chandelier had fallen during the blaze, killing the father instantly. The rest of the family perished shortly after, their attempts to escape thwarted by locked doors and windows. The tragedy had made headlines at the time, but as the years passed, the story faded into obscurity. The dining room, turned out, had been the epicenter of the fire. That evening, I shared what I'd learned with Laura. Her face turned ashen as I recounted the details. "Do you think it's them?" she asked. I didn't know what to think, but as we sat there in the living room, the house seemed to come alive around us. The lights dimmed, the air grew cold, and from the dining room came the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. "We need to do something," Laura said, her voice trembling. We decided to reach out to a local paranormal investigator. When she arrived, she immediately sensed the house's oppressive energy. "There's a presence here," she said. "It's tied to the chandelier and the events of that night." She suggested a cleansing ritual to help the spirits move on. Together, we lit candles in the dining room and placed a wreath beneath the chandelier, a symbol of peace and remembrance. As we stood in a circle, the investigator spoke softly, addressing the spirits directly. "We acknowledge your pain and your loss," she said. "This house is no longer yours, but we honor your memory. It's time to let go." The air seemed to shift, growing colder before suddenly warming again. The chandelier trembled once more, but this time felt less menacing, as if it were saying goodbye. Since that night, the house has been quiet. The chandelier no longer sways, the lights no longer flicker, and the whispers have ceased. But every Christmas, as we gather in the dining room, I can't help but glance up at the chandelier, half expecting it to move again. I like to think the Harpers found peace, their spirits finally free from the tragedy that bound them. But part of me knows that the past is never truly gone. It lingers, waiting in the shadows, a reminder that some places never forget. Story number 7. The Silent Hour. I've always thought of Christmas as a season of comfort, a time when the world slows down, and the warmth of family fills the chill of winter nights. But Christmas Eve of 2016, in a quiet house tucked deep within the snow-blanketed woods of Vermont, shattered that illusion for me. That was the night time itself stopped, and I came face to face with a silence that was anything but peaceful. My wife, Sarah, our 10-year-old son, Jacob, and I had moved to Vermont earlier that year, seeking respite from the noise of city life. Our house was a charming old farmhouse, surrounded by pines that stood like silent sentinels against the cold. It had quirks, creaky floors, drafty windows, and an ancient grandfather clock in the hallway that chimed faithfully on the hour. But we loved it. It felt like a place where memories could be made. That Christmas Eve, the snow was falling softly, muffling the world in a serene white hush. The house smelled of roasted ham, cinnamon, and pine, and the fireplace crackled warmly in the living room. We had spent the day decorating the tree, wrapping presents, and preparing the perfect Christmas dinner. As the clock struck 7 p.m., we sat down at the dining table, ready to enjoy the feast Sarah had spent hours preparing. The three of us talked and laughed as we passed dishes around. Jacob was particularly animated, recounting a school story with the kind of energy only a child possesses. The sound of his laughter filled the room, mixing with the clink of cutlery and the soft hum of the grandfather clock. And then, at precisely 8 p.m., everything stopped. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a thick, oppressive quiet that pressed down on me, as though the air itself had been drained of life. I turned to Sarah, ready to ask if she'd noticed it too. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. My voice was gone. Jacob looked at me, his wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. His lips moved, forming the word "Dad." But I couldn't hear him. I couldn't hear anything. Not the clock, not the fire, not even the faint whistle of wind against the windows. Panic began to set in. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor in a gesture that should have been deafening but was utterly silent. Sarah reached for my hand, her grip tight, and pointed toward the clock in the hallway. The hands were frozen at 8 o'clock, the pendulum hanging motionless. I tried to move, to shout, to do something, anything, but it was as if the air itself resisted me. Thick and unyielding, the room grew colder, the warmth of the fire replaced by an icy chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The lights above us flickered, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. And then I felt it, a presence. It wasn't something I could see, but I knew it was there. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab Sarah and Jacob and flee. But I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, as though unseen hands were holding me in place. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shadows on the wall shift, moving in ways that didn't align with the flickering flames. One shadow, darker and more defined than the others, stretched across the room, creeping closer to the table. It had no source, no object or figure to cast it, yet it moved with purpose. Jacob clutched Sarah's arm, his face pale. Tears welled in his eyes, and I could see his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But the words were trapped inside me. The shadow reached the center of the table and stopped. For a moment, the room was utterly still, and then, slowly, the plates and glasses began to tremble. One by one, they slid toward the edge of the table, as though pushed by invisible hands. A glass toppled and shattered on the floor, its soundless fragments glinting in the dim light. Just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The warmth returned, the oppressive silence lifted, and the clock in the hallway resumed its steady ticking. The hands now read 8:10, as if the lost 10 minutes had never existed. I collapsed into my chair, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah was shaking, her face pale. What just happened?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Jacob buried his face in her shoulder, sobbing quietly. "It was here," he said, his voice muffled. "I saw it." "What did you see?" I asked, my own voice trembling. Jacob hesitated, his small body trembling. "A man," he said finally. "Or something like a man. It was watching us." The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and confusion. None of us could sleep. We stayed together in the living room, the fireplace blazing as if its warmth could ward off whatever had invaded our home. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, set us on edge. The next morning, I began searching for answers. I called the previous owners, hoping they could shed some light on what we'd experienced. At first, they were reluctant to talk, but eventually, the truth came out. Decades ago, the house had belonged to a family much like ours, a couple with a young daughter. One Christmas Eve, a fire broke out in the middle of the night. The family never made it out. The neighbors said the fire started in the dining room, near the grandfather clock. Ever since, strange occurrences had plagued the house, always around Christmas. "It's the house's way of remembering," the previous owner said, his voice heavy. "Or maybe it's them, trying to make sure no one forgets." We stayed in the house for another year, but things were never the same. Every Christmas Eve, at exactly 8 p.m., the clocks would stop, and the silence would return. We never saw the shadow again, but the memory of that night lingered, a reminder that some things cannot be explained. Eventually, we sold the house and moved back to the city. But every Christmas, when the clock strikes 8 o'clock, I find myself holding my breath, listening for a silence that feels heavier than any sound.